Ethan Caldwell was the kind of billionaire the world loved to admire. Powerful, polished, and completely untouchable. So when he invited a homeless old man to his luxury charity gala as a joke, nobody in that glittering ballroom thought twice about it. Nobody laughed louder than the people at those linen-covered tables. But there was something none of them knew about the old man in the worn suit. And the moment he took that microphone, the laughter stopped. The room went silent, and Ethan Caldwell's carefully constructed world began to fall apart in front of everyone. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Caldwell Grand was the kind of ballroom that made ordinary people feel small on purpose. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with gold leaf. Circular tables draped in ivory linen stretched the full length of the floor, each one set with china that cost more per plate than most families spent on groceries in a month. The floral centerpieces alone had taken a team of decorators 2 full days to arrange. White orchids and dark calla lilies that nobody would actually look at once the wine started flowing. It was the night of Ethan Caldwell's annual charity gala, and every detail had been chosen to communicate the same message. I am important, and being near me matters. Ethan himself stood near the entrance to the main hall, adjusting his cufflinks. He was 44 years old, lean in the way that expensive personal trainers made possible. He with silver at his temples that photographers always said made him look distinguished. His charcoal tuxedo had been pressed that morning by someone whose name he didn't know. His smile was on, practiced, warm, exactly 20% narrower than genuine. And it had been on since he stepped out of the car. That smile was part of the machinery of an evening like this. It cost nothing and bought everything. 12 cameras from 4 different outlets, murmured his assistant, Daniel Hurst, appearing at his left shoulder with a tablet. 3 board members from the Whitmore Foundation have confirmed. And the senator's office just responded. She's not coming personally, but she's sending her deputy chief of staff. That's fine, Ethan said, though it wasn't. A deputy was a slight, and Ethan cataloged slights the way other men cataloged compliments. He stored them quietly and returned to them later. Make sure the deputy gets seated at table 6, close enough to feel included, far enough that I don't have to talk to him. Daniel made the note without blinking. He had worked for Ethan for 6 years and understood the architecture of his employer's attention, broad enough to fill a room, narrow enough to crush one person at a time. What Ethan had not told Daniel, had not told anyone in the room yet, was that tonight had a problem underneath the polish. 3 weeks earlier, a financial journalist had published a piece about Caldwell Capital's acquisition practices that used words like predatory and community displacement without quite crossing into actionable territory. It had been shared enough times that Ethan's PR team had started using the phrase reputational drift in morning briefings, which was the polished way of saying that people who used to admire him were beginning to ask questions instead. His publicist, a driven woman named Renee Slade, had spent the last 2 weeks architecting a solution. The gala's charity donation was already planned, but Renee wanted something with more texture, something visual, something that moved people. "We need a story," she'd told him during a strategy session 4 days ago, sitting around his conference table with the city spread out below the glass wall behind her. Not a number, not a press release, a moment people can feel. One of Ethan's friends, Harrison Walsh, old money, newer opinions, he always slightly too loud after the second drink, had leaned back in his chair and laughed. Simple. Invite a homeless man. Show the world how generous you are. He'd meant it as a joke, the kind of thing you say to fill space at a table of people who assume they'll never have to act on anything uncomfortable. Ethan had not laughed. He had looked at the table for a long moment and then said, "Set it up." Renee had gone quiet. Daniel had written it down. The city outside the Caldwell Grand was a different country at night. 3 blocks from the hotel, past the lit storefronts and the parked town cars, the sidewalk narrowed and darkened, and the sounds changed. It was there that Ethan's car slid to a stop at 7:15 the following evening, on the driver keeping the engine running while Ethan stepped out into air that smelled like exhaust and damp pavement. He had told Daniel to narrow it down. He wanted someone visible, but not unstable, presentable, but clearly in need, someone photogenic in their circumstances, which was the kind of thing Ethan was able to think without flinching. There were 3 people on that stretch of sidewalk. 2 did not hold his attention. The third was an older black man sitting on a folded piece of cardboard near the mouth of an alley. He was perhaps in his late 60s, with a white beard trimmed closer than his situation suggested should be possible, and eyes that were scanning the street with the calm, deliberate attention of someone who had learned to read environments very carefully. His clothes were worn and layered, a flannel shirt beneath a jacket that had once been waterproof, and his shoes were cracked along the sole in a way that spoke of many miles walked without replacement. But before Ethan had fully assessed him, the man did something that stopped him in place. A young woman had been struggling with a stroller 20 feet away. A wheel had jammed on an uneven square of sidewalk, and her baby was beginning to make the particular sound that preceded escalation. The older man stood up without hurry, crossed the distance, crouched beside the stroller, and fixed the wheel with 2 practiced adjustments of his hand. He said something to the woman that made her exhale in relief. Then he returned to his cardboard square as if he'd simply stepped away to breathe. He did not look at Ethan. Not once. Not through any of it. That was what decided it. Not charity, not optics. Something else. Something Ethan identified later, alone in his car, as the irritation of being disregarded. He crossed the sidewalk, Daniel half a step behind him. He stopped in front of the man and said, "I have a proposal for you." The man looked up. His eyes were dark and clear, and they moved over Ethan's face with an assessment that felt uncomfortably mutual. He did not stand. He did not ask what kind of proposal. He simply waited, which forced Ethan to keep talking. "I'm hosting a charity gala tomorrow evening," Ethan said. "I'd like you to attend as my guest. We'll get you cleaned up, dressed appropriately. You'll be introduced. I'll make a donation in your name. It's a good deal." There was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. "What's your name?" the man asked. His voice was quiet and unhurried. "Ethan Caldwell." A pause. The man's expression shifted in a way that was impossible to fully read. Not surprise, not deference. Something older and more interior than either. "My name is Samuel Reed," the man said, "and I'll come, but I won't be quiet." Ethan had almost smiled at that. He'd assumed it was the bargaining of a man who had very little left to bargain with, a small assertion of dignity before accepting the terms. He'd heard that kind of thing before. He was already thinking about the cameras. Preparation for the gala began before dawn the next morning in Ethan's penthouse offices on the 42nd floor. Ethan ran through his remarks 3 times with Renee, adjusting the phrasing around the charity moment until it sat in his mouth the way he wanted it to. He wanted it to sound spontaneous. He wanted it to sound like compassion had occurred to him organically, the way it occurred to good men. Renee suggested softer word choices in 2 places, and he accepted one of them. Across the city, in a room at the hotel where Daniel had arranged for Samuel to spend the night, a different kind of preparation was underway. A stylist named Cora had been brought in to fit Samuel with a suit from a mid-range rental collection. She'd brought 4 options, uncertain of the size. Samuel had assessed them briefly, chosen the darkest one, and changed without much conversation. He'd accepted the shirt, the shoes, the tie. He'd declined the pocket square. Cora had noted, without saying anything about it, that he kept one thing from his original clothes, a bracelet on his left wrist, worn and engraved, that looked like it had been made from a material somewhere between leather and metal. He'd moved it from one wrist to the other to accommodate the shirt cuff and fastened it again before anything else. She hadn't asked about it. Something in the way he handled it told her not to. When Samuel was dressed, Cora stepped back and looked at him properly for the first time. The suit fit better than she'd expected. He stood straight, with the particular posture of someone who had spent a long time not allowing themselves to be diminished by their circumstances. She realized, standing in that small hotel room, that she was looking at a man who had not simply been tidied up. She was looking at someone who had always looked like this underneath. She kept that thought to herself, too. The ballroom filled quickly after 7. Ethan worked the room the way he always did, moving clockwise, remembering names, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments. He had the particular gift of making each person feel briefly selected, which was different from making them feel seen, but served the same short-term function. Board members, donors, journalists with invitations, 2 minor celebrities whose presence had been arranged by Renee for the images they would generate the next morning. It was Lena Carter's job to make sure all of this looked like a natural gathering of people rather than the carefully engineered production that it was. Lena was 31 years old and had been coordinating events of this scale for nearly a decade, which meant she had developed the professional skill of appearing calm while quietly managing approximately 40 things at once. She was the one who knew where every vendor was, why the third table from the left was 2 inches off its mark, and which of the catering staff was moving too slowly on refills. She had built a career in spaces that noticed everything about the quality of the flower arrangements and very little about the people keeping them standing. She was checking the AV system near the back of the room when Samuel arrived. She noticed him immediately, not because he stood out in the way someone underdressed would stand out, but because of the opposite. He was dressed correctly, carried himself without performance, and scanned the ballroom with the kind of unhurried attention that Lena associated with people who had once been responsible for large rooms. She watched him take in the chandeliers, the table arrangement, the position of the cameras. He looked like a man cataloging a space, not a man overwhelmed by one. Then she noticed the bracelet. It caught the light as he moved, and it didn't match anything else about the evening. Not the rented elegance around him, not the polished surfaces of the room. It looked old in a way that was specific rather than neglected, like something that had been kept. Before she could move toward him, Ethan had crossed the room to where Samuel stood near the entrance. He placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder in the practiced way he placed hands on shoulders, which was firmly enough to establish positioning without quite being a grip. "Glad you made it," Ethan said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. "This is exactly what tonight is about." Samuel looked at the hand on his shoulder. Then he looked at Ethan. He said nothing. Ethan kept smiling and guided him toward a table near the front. The guests who noticed the arrival did so in the way that ballrooms notice things, in stages, a ripple of whispers moving outward from the center. Some simply stared. A woman near table 4 leaned toward her companion and said something behind her champagne glass. A man across the room straightened slightly, as if the situation required a posture adjustment. Samuel walked through all of it without changing his pace. He walked like he belonged, not with defiance, not with performance. Just with the particular calm of someone who has decided, at some point, long before this moment, that the evaluation of a room does not determine the truth of a person. Ethan introduced him to the table with a short, carefully phrased statement about generosity and community and the importance of seeing beyond surfaces. A few people applauded. The applause had the quality of something done to fill a gap rather than express genuine feeling. Samuel sat down. He placed his hands on the table. He looked at the people around him. Nobody spoke to him for several minutes, and he did not appear to require them to. Across the room, Lena watched, and she began, slowly, to feel that something about this evening was going to go differently than anyone had planned. The first course arrived, and with it, the particular performance of a dinner table that had decided to pretend someone wasn't there. Samuel had been seated between a property developer named Grant Holloway and a woman named Patricia Oakes, who sat on the board of 2 nonprofits and spent a significant portion of each year reminding people of that fact. Grant spent the first 12 minutes talking past Samuel to the person seated on his other side, a conversation about a ski property in Colorado that required no contribution from anyone outside it. Patricia occasionally glanced at Samuel with the expression of someone who has encountered something unexpected in a familiar place and has not yet decided what to do about it. The man across the table, younger, louder, and already on his second glass of wine, finally broke the silence in Samuel's direction by turning toward him with the wide, performative warmth of someone about to be generous in a way they will remember. "So," he said, "how does it feel? Being here, I mean." After, he gestured vaguely, "everything." The table quieted in the particular way that tables quiet when something uncomfortable is about to become visible. Samuel looked at him, not quickly, not sharply. He simply settled his gaze on the man the way you settle something heavy and deliberate onto a surface. "I've never needed rescuing," Samuel said. His voice was calm, conversational even. There was no anger in it, which was perhaps the reason it landed the way it did. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. This was something else, a correction delivered without heat. That left no obvious place to respond. The young man across the table opened his mouth and then closed it again. Grant turned back to his Colorado conversation. Patricia lifted her water glass. The table resumed its noise, and Samuel returned to eating, unhurried. Lena had positioned herself near the edge of the room where she could see most of the floor while remaining accessible to the catering staff. It was where she always stood during the meal portion of evenings like this, close enough to intervene, far enough to observe. She watched Table 3 with the particular attention she'd learned to apply when something felt misaligned. She'd been in enough rooms like this one to know that the discomfort around Samuel wasn't simple unfamiliarity. There was something else underneath it, something that came from Samuel himself. But from the quality of his stillness and the way the bracelet on his wrist caught the light every time he moved. After the appetizer plates were cleared, she crossed the floor toward him. She didn't approach the way guests were approaching him, with the wide, managed smiles of people performing an act of charity. She approached the way she would approach anyone she wanted to have an actual conversation with, directly, making eye contact before she arrived. "I'm Lena Carter," she said. "I'm coordinating the event. Is there anything you need?" Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition of the absence of performance. "I'm fine," he said. "But you can sit, if you like." She sat in the empty chair beside him, the one that had been pointedly unoccupied since the seating began. And for the next several minutes they talked in the low register of 2 people having a real conversation inside a loud room. He asked her how long she'd been doing this kind of work. She told him. He asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he'd actually been listening to the first answer, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. He mentioned, without making a point of it, something about supply chain logistics in large event productions that told her he understood systems at a level that had nothing to do with the decorative role he'd been assigned for the evening. She mentioned the catering contracts. He said something about competitive bidding structures in service industries that was accurate and specific and came from somewhere. She studied him. "What did you do?" she asked. "Before." Samuel looked at her steadily. "A lot of things," he said. "Built things, mostly." She wanted to ask more, but on the other side of the room, Ethan was moving in their direction with the deliberate, course-correcting stride of a man who had noticed something happening that he hadn't arranged. Ethan had been watching Samuel's table for most of the meal. He'd expected the older man to be visibly overwhelmed, to eat carefully, to glance around with the humbled gratitude of someone experiencing this level for the first time. That was the image he'd been building toward, the image Renee could work with. Instead, Samuel had been eating at a measured pace and talking to Lena with the composure of a man attending a professional function. It was infuriating in a way Ethan couldn't quite articulate without it sounding small, so he articulated it to himself differently. Samuel wasn't playing his part. The evening needed a particular shape, and Samuel's behavior was working against it. He reached the table and placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder again, the second time now, and said, in the broad voice he used for audiences, "I want our guest of honor to feel properly welcomed." He said it to the table, not to Samuel. "Samuel, why don't you stand for a moment? Let everyone see you." It was subtle, but it was also unmistakable. The request to perform gratitude for a room that was watching with a mixture of pity and entertainment. Then Samuel set down his fork. He looked up at Ethan. Then, with a deliberateness that made the motion itself carry meaning, he stood. He did not smile. He did not look grateful. He looked at Ethan for a long beat, and then he looked slowly around the room, at the guests, at the cameras near the side wall, at the photograph display Ethan had erected near the back corner featuring the company's history in framed images. Then he sat back down and picked up his fork. Ethan laughed, an easy, performed laugh, and moved away. But the laugh was 2 beats too long, and several people at the table noticed. Lena noticed most of all. Near the photo wall, Samuel had paused on his way to the restroom. He stood in front of the display for longer than the restroom errand would have required, and Lena, who had followed the movement at a professional distance, watched him from across the room. He was looking at a specific image, one of the larger framed photographs on the right side of the wall, a development project from the late 90s or early 2000s, judging by the image quality. A building in a neighborhood she didn't immediately recognize, with a groundbreaking ceremony in the foreground and several men in suits holding shovels. She was too far away to see the details clearly, but she could see that Samuel had gone very still in front of it. His right hand came up slowly and rested against the frame, not touching the image itself, just the frame. He stood like that for perhaps 8 seconds. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and continued toward the restroom. Lena looked at the photograph from across the room and felt the shape of something she couldn't yet name, a history underneath the surface of the evening that she hadn't been given access to. The bracelet, the way he'd spoken about systems and structures, the stillness in front of that photograph. She took out her phone and made a note. The wine had been flowing for nearly 2 hours by the time Ethan signaled Daniel to begin preparing the stage for the charity segment. The room had loosened in the way rooms do after the second bottle. Voices louder, laughter quicker to arrive, the social armor worn a little lighter. Which was, Ethan knew, exactly the right condition for what he intended to do next. A slightly loosened room was more susceptible to the kind of emotional moment he was engineering. They'd be quicker to feel whatever he pointed them toward. He had designed the charity highlight with Renee in 2 sessions. The plan was this. Ethan would make brief remarks about the importance of seeing and acknowledging those who had fallen through the gaps of society. He would thank Samuel by name, in warm and general terms, for allowing his presence to serve as a reminder of what generosity could look like when it was genuine rather than performative. Which was, he was aware, one of the more audacious things he had ever arranged to say publicly. Then he would invite Samuel to the stage for a brief moment. Samuel would speak. Something real, something raw, something the cameras would catch, something small and human that Ethan could frame as the evening's emotional center. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. All it required was that Samuel behave the way someone in his position was expected to behave. Lena, moving near the stage to verify the mic setup, caught something in Samuel's posture as Daniel approached his table with the news that the remarks segment was beginning. Samuel did not react with nervousness. He did not look toward the stage with the expression of someone steeling themselves for something uncomfortable. He set his napkin down, touched the bracelet on his wrist with 2 fingers, a gesture so brief it could have been nothing, and looked at Lena across the room. She went to him. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, standing close enough that the conversation stayed between them. Samuel looked at her with an expression she would remember for a long time afterward. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even determination in the way that word usually meant. It was something older and more patient. "No," he said, "I've been waiting for this." She wanted to ask what that meant. Before she could, Ethan's voice filled the room, warm and crafted and carrying perfectly through the acoustics of the Caldwell Grand, beginning the remarks that were supposed to end with Samuel's gratitude on display for 12 cameras and a room full of people who had not thought once all evening about who he really was. Victor Lang had been watching Samuel read since the man entered the room. Victor was 51, a businessman of considerable reach in his own right, though he operated in Ethan's shadow more often than he liked, and had never fully resolved his feelings about that arrangement. He had come to the gala for the same reason he came to most functions connected to Ethan Caldwell, professional proximity, which was a resource he spent carefully. But Samuel had pulled his attention away from the room's usual circuitry. Victor's hands were wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't drunk from in 20 minutes. He stood near the edge of the room, slightly apart from the groups forming and dissolving around him, watching the older man at table 3 with the focused stillness of someone trying to remember something just outside their reach. He had the feeling, the specific, uncomfortable feeling, of recognizing a person from a context so far removed from the present one that the recognition itself seemed impossible. He'd like seeing someone from a dream and knowing you should know them and not yet being able to place where from. He watched Samuel stand for Ethan's performative applause and sit back down without expression. He watched the hand touch the bracelet. He watched the stillness at the photo wall. And somewhere in his chest, a slow and unwelcome recognition began to assemble itself. It came in pieces, the way memory does when it has been buried rather than simply forgotten. A conference room. A younger version of this face across a table, arguing with a patience that frustrated everyone around it. A set of blueprints. A voice that moved with authority, and an absolute refusal to be talked past. Victor had been younger then, much younger, and far more willing to tell himself that what was happening around him was not his business. He set his water glass down and breathed slowly. He whispered to no one in particular, too quietly for anyone around him to hear. "I knew it." The lights on the stage brightened. Ethan was tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said, with the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed warmth until it resembled the real thing, "let's hear from our special guest of the evening." Applause moved through the room, bright and social on the surface, with an undercurrent of entertainment-seeking that had nothing to do with honor. Samuel Reed placed both hands on the table. He pushed back his chair. He stood with the slow deliberateness of someone who has decided irrevocably that the moment has arrived. He looked at Ethan across the room, not with anger, not with nerves. With the particular calm of a man who has been waiting a very long time and has finally arrived at the day he was waiting for. And he began to walk toward the stage. The walk from the table to the podium was not long, perhaps 40 feet across a polished ballroom floor, but Samuel Reed made it last. He did not hurry. He did not look at the audience on either side of him. He kept his eyes forward, his hands loose at his sides, and his pace even and unhurried, the way a man walks when he has already decided that nothing in the room has the authority to rush him. The guests tracked him in silence, not the respectful silence of a room welcoming someone, but the held-breath silence of a room that isn't sure what it is about to witness. Ethan stood at the edge of the stage with his polished smile in place. one hand extended toward the podium in the generous gesture of a host transferring his platform to someone smaller. He had done this kind of thing before, offered the mic to a child at a school event, passed it to a veteran at a fundraiser, and the gesture always photographed beautifully. His PR instincts told him this moment would be no different. The cameras were positioned. The lighting was correct. Samuel reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, not dramatically, just practically, the way someone does when they intend to be heard, and placed both hands on the sides of the stand. He looked out at the room. The audience looked back. And then Samuel said nothing. 5 seconds passed, then 8. The silence moved from comfortable to uncertain to something closer to tense. A man near the front shifted in his seat. A woman to the left set down her champagne glass with a small, careful click. Someone near the back gave a brief social laugh, the kind that fills uncomfortable space, and went quiet when nobody joined it. Ethan's smile held, but behind it something was recalibrating. At 12 seconds, the silence became its own kind of statement, a controlled, deliberate thing that Samuel was using the way other speakers used volume. He was not frozen. He was not nervous. He was not searching for words. He was simply refusing to begin until the room had stopped performing and started listening, and the room, without quite understanding what was happening to it, was giving itself over 1 second at a time. People set down glasses. Side conversations cut themselves short. The cameras, which had been panning to cover the crowd, had found the stage and stayed there. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and clear and carried to the back of the ballroom without effort. "You invited me here to prove something," he said. "Didn't you?" He was not looking at the audience when he said it. He was looking directly at Ethan. Ethan's smile adjusted, narrowed slightly, brightened slightly, the professional equivalent of a recalibration. He gave a small laugh meant to signal to the room that this was charming. This was part of the moment. This was the kind of genuine, unscripted thing that made charity events meaningful. Several people in the front rows responded to his cue and smiled along. Samuel waited for the smile to settle. Then he continued. "You built this room very carefully," he said, addressing the audience now, moving his gaze slowly across the tables. The table settings, the lighting, the way the cameras are positioned." He glanced briefly toward the side wall where the press cameras were stationed, and 2 of the photographers, caught in the acknowledgement, lowered their lenses slightly. The order of the evening. Every piece of it designed to produce a particular feeling in the people watching. I've been in rooms like this before. Not at this table, but in rooms with the same architecture of intent. The murmuring that moved through the audience then was the quiet, uncertain kind. Not laughter, not protest, just the sound of people exchanging glances. Ethan stepped forward from the edge of the stage, positioning himself within the peripheral frame of Samuel's presence. And it was a move meant to signal shared ownership of the moment, to remind the room that this was still Ethan's evening. He opened his mouth. Samuel spoke first, without raising his voice or acknowledging the movement. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, "was awake at 4:47 this morning." The room went very still. He reviewed his remarks 3 times before 6, changed 2 phrases on the advice of his publicist. He had black coffee, no sugar, and stood at the window of his 42nd floor office for 11 minutes before his driver arrived. Samuel paused. He has a particular habit when he is anxious. He adjusts his left cufflink. He has done it 4 times since I entered this room. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight. A woman near the center table said something to her companion in a voice barely above a whisper. A board member in the 3rd row put down his fork with the careful movement of someone who wanted his hands free. Ethan had gone completely still, not the practiced stillness of a man in control, but the rigid stillness of a man whose next move had disappeared. How does he know that? someone said, just loudly enough to be heard by the tables nearby. Another voice from a different part of the room. "Who is this man?" Lena was standing near the back corner, and she felt the shift in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not through any single sound or movement, but through the cumulative weight of dozens of people adjusting their understanding of what was happening. She looked at Samuel's wrist. The bracelet. The way he'd spoken to her about systems and logistics. The photograph on the wall. She pulled out her phone. Samuel had not raised his voice once. That was what made it so effective. There was no anger in his delivery, no trembling outrage, no theatrical buildup. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have thought about a thing so long and so carefully that emotion has been replaced by something more durable. Clarity. This evening, he said, was designed around a particular assumption. That a man in worn clothes, a man who sleeps outside, a man who society has finished categorizing, that such a man would come to a room like this one and feel grateful. That he would understand the gift being offered. That he would perform a version of humility that would photograph well and allow the people watching to feel that generosity had occurred. He looked slowly around the room, giving no single section more attention than another. That the man in question would be so stunned by the chandeliers and the china and the invitation that he would forget, for one useful evening, that he had ever been anything other than what you see when you look at me now. He looked at Ethan. That assumption was wrong. Ethan's right hand moved. Lena, watching from the back, tracked the movement, his left cufflink. Samuel turned back to the room and said without pause, "I know about the Grayfield acquisition. I know what the public filings said, and I know what the private communications said. And I know that those two things do not match." The sound that moved through the room then was not a murmur. It was sharper, a collective intake, a handful of chairs adjusting, a sudden focused attention that replaced the social noise entirely. Grayfield was not a name that had been in the news publicly. It had appeared in the financial journalist's piece 3 weeks earlier, but only as a passing reference, a footnote in a list of acquisitions, not a subject of examination. For most people in the room, it meant nothing at all. It was a word that slid past them like any unfamiliar proper noun in a sentence that seemed to belong to someone else's story. But for the 4 board members seated across 2 different tables and for the man standing at the edge of the stage, it meant something very specific. It meant a deal conducted through layered intermediary entities. It meant a neighborhood that no longer looked the way it had looked before the contracts were signed. It meant conversations that had taken place in rooms with no public record of what was agreed in them. Ethan moved toward the podium with the manner of a man who has decided to take back a situation. His voice, when he found it, was measured but bright, still performing for the room. "Samuel, I think what we're seeing here is some confusion about—" "I'm not confused," Samuel said quietly. He did not move away from the microphone. Ethan stopped. The room watched. Victor Lang, standing near the far wall, had not moved in several minutes. He had the posture of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is now watching someone else lift it with one hand. His face was not readable from across the room, but Lena, who had glanced at him twice in the last few minutes, thought she saw his jaw tighten. She was right. Victor stood absolutely still and breathed through the recognition of what was coming. The slow, inevitable arrival of a truth he had spent years keeping at the edge of his peripheral vision. He said nothing, but his eyes did not leave the stage. Samuel's voice had changed slightly. It had not gotten louder or harder. It had gotten quieter, a register shift that made the room lean in rather than pull back, the way a confession operates differently from an accusation. "I'm not here with anger," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I need this room to feel sorry for me. I am past the age of needing that from people I don't respect. He paused. "I'm here because of something simpler, because the truth has a weight, and the man standing at the edge of this stage has been walking around without carrying his share of it for a very long time. And that particular imbalance has a cost. It has always had a cost. The people paying it are just not in this room." He let that land. Then, "You built your empire on something you stole." The room erupted, not into chaos, but into the kind of noise that a room makes when a significant number of people begin processing something at the same time. Chairs scraped. Voices broke across each other. A photographer raised his camera. Two of the board members were now leaning across their tables toward each other in rapid, low conversation. Ethan's smile was gone. It had not faded gradually the way expressions do when they become unnecessary. It had simply stopped, switched off, and what was underneath it was something that the people who knew Ethan Caldwell well, who had spent years reading the space beneath the performance, recognized as something between fear and calculation. He was still standing at the edge of the stage. He had not moved since Samuel said he was not confused. His hands were at his sides and his left cufflink was undone. Samuel looked at him with the expression of a man who has said the first necessary thing and is now prepared, with full patience, to say the rest. The noise in the room lasted perhaps 40 seconds before something stranger replaced it. A spreading, uneven quiet that moved outward from the stage, like water leveling. It began at the front tables, the board members, the senior donors, the people who understood enough about Ethan's business affairs to know that the word stole was not a metaphor they could simply dismiss. It moved through the middle of the room next, reaching the journalists and the minor celebrities and the foundation representatives, people whose professional reflexes told them to hold still and take in information before reacting. It reached the back last, and by the time it arrived there, the ballroom had transformed from a social event into something closer to a held breath. Ethan stepped forward again, this time with more purpose. His voice came back, not the warm, practiced version, but a harder variant underneath it, the kind that people who had negotiated against him in closed rooms would have recognized. "I think what we have here," he said, addressing the room with the confident manner of a man reasserting position, "is a gentleman who is understandably emotional. These situations can produce confusion. Samuel, we can—" "I'm not emotional," Samuel said, not unkindly, as a simple statement of fact. He did not move from the podium. He did not raise his voice. He simply remained there, with his hands on the sides of the stand, with the microphone inches from his mouth, with the entire room watching. And the effect of that stillness was devastating in a way that any argument would not have been. An argument would have given Ethan something to counter. Stillness gave him nothing. "I can come back to the podium when you're finished," Samuel added. A sound moved through the audience, not laughter, not quite, but something adjacent. The sound of a room recognizing that the power in a situation has shifted, and not in the direction that was intended. Ethan looked at the cameras. He looked at his board members. He looked at Renee Slade, who had emerged from the side of the room and was now standing very still near the staff entrance with the expression of someone who has watched a production go badly wrong and is calculating losses in real time. He stepped back. Lena was no longer standing at the back of the room. She had moved to the event coordination station near the far wall, a narrow table with a laptop, 2 tablets, and a direct line to the building's AV and security systems. She had told the junior staff member covering the station to take a break, and she had sat down alone and opened the laptop. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. She started with the name, Samuel Reed. She added keywords and variations: engineer, urban planning, community development, the approximate time period she was estimating from his age, and the photograph she'd seen on the wall. The search returned very little at first, A few generic results with no connection, the name appearing in unrelated contexts, the particular blankness of a person who had been removed from the places their name would naturally appear. That blankness itself told her something. People didn't vanish from professional records by accident. They vanished because the records had been unmaintained, or because the records had been actively disconnected from the person they belonged to. She refined the search, adding the city, and adding a neighborhood name she half remembered from the district visible in the background of the Gala's photo display. A result appeared that made her stop. It was a brief archived mention in a city planning newsletter from many years earlier, a committee meeting summary that referenced a proposed development framework called the Crown Meridian Project, and listed, among its authors, a Dr. Samuel Reed, described as a civil engineer and urban development strategist. She read it twice. She looked up at the stage where Samuel was standing with the quiet authority of a man who had just told a room of powerful people that he remembered where they had been standing when the theft occurred. She looked back at the screen. Then she opened a second search window. She kept going. At the podium, Samuel had reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. The motion was slow and deliberate, the kind of motion that fills a room with attention before it completes itself. He withdrew a folded piece of paper. Not a phone, not a modern document. A physical piece of paper folded in thirds, with the worn creases of something that had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. He placed it on the podium surface in front of him, smoothed it once with his palm, and did not look at it again. He looked at the room. "Decades ago," he said, "I designed something. It wasn't a building exactly, though buildings were part of it. It was a model, a framework for how a community could develop without destroying itself in the process. Mixed-income housing structures with legal ownership protections built into the foundation documents. Apprenticeship pipelines that kept the economic value of construction inside the neighborhood rather than extracting it. Long-term equity provisions that meant families who had been in a community for generations had a path toward owning a piece of what was being built around them." He paused. It was called the Crown Meridian Project. A murmur moved through the room. Not everyone recognized the name, but some people did, enough to feel the current of recognition shift something in the air. "I spent years on that work," Samuel continued. "Not in an office somewhere removed from the communities it was designed to serve. I was in those neighborhoods. I knew the families. I knew the block captains and the church leaders and the small business owners who had watched 3 previous rounds of development move through their streets like weather, taking things away, leaving different things behind, never asking what the people actually living there needed." His voice remained level. The Crown Meridian Project was my answer to that pattern. It was going to be the proof that development didn't have to be extraction. He paused and looked directly at Ethan. It never got to be that proof, because someone got to it first. The lights seemed brighter on the stage now, or perhaps it was simply that the room had grown so quiet that everything felt more exposed. Yet a memory surface was working in real time through the audience, people connecting what they knew about Ethan Caldwell's early business history to what they were now hearing and finding that the edges didn't quite align the way they had been told to align. The Caldwell family legacy had always been presented as a story of vision and risk and honest ambition. Charles Caldwell, Ethan's late father, was the kind of businessman whose portrait hung in boardrooms and whose name appeared on foundation buildings, a man history had already processed and approved. Samuel's words were doing something to that approval. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I was a perfect man," Samuel said. "I was stubborn. I argued when I should have listened. I trusted my own judgment past the point where other people's doubts deserved more of my attention. I made the particular mistake that people make when they believe in something completely. I assumed that the strength of the idea would protect it." His jaw tightened slightly. "It doesn't. Ideas don't protect themselves. People protect them. And when the wrong people get close to them first, ideas become weapons. He straightened and looked at the folded document on the podium without touching it. This is an original planning document from the Crown Meridian Project. It has dates. It has authorship designations. It has amendment logs that show exactly when certain protections were removed and certain language was changed and certain community stakeholders were quietly removed from the approval chain. He placed one finger on the edge of the paper. It tells a story about how something built to help people was taken apart and rebuilt to profit from them, and it tells that story very clearly. Victor Lang had moved. He had left his position near the far wall and was now standing closer to the stage, not quite at the foot of it, but closer than spectator distance. He was no longer holding his water glass. His arms were at his sides, and his face had the careful, flattened expression of a man working very hard to keep his emotional response from arriving before he was ready for it. Ethan saw him move, and something shifted behind his eyes. The two men had known each other long enough that Ethan could read Victor's positioning. Victor being closer was not neutral. Victor being closer meant something was about to happen that Victor intended to be associated with. You recognize this, Samuel said, and it took Ethan a moment to realize Samuel was speaking to him directly again. You recognize this document because you sat in the room where this work was done. You were younger then. You didn't speak much. You watched, and you learned, and you said very little, but you were there. Ethan's mouth opened. You're distorting? You were there, Samuel said again, simply and without elaboration. The room heard the difference between the two voices. One was scrambling for language. The other had already chosen its words and had no need to rush them. The man who sat in those rooms more than anyone else was not Ethan, Samuel said. It was his father. Charles Caldwell's name settled over the room with a particular weight. Because Charles had been dead for several years, and the dead are not available to defend themselves, which means the living carry a complicated and often unexamined relationship to their legacy. A man who dies well regarded leaves his reputation in the hands of everyone who benefited from knowing him, and those people, consciously or not, have every incentive to protect what they were given. The portrait of Charles Caldwell that hung in Ethan's corporate headquarters showed a man of serious, dignified bearing. Nobody in that boardroom had ever been asked to consider what the painting left out. Charles Caldwell told me he believed in the work. He said he wanted to partner with the project, not to take it over, but to provide the capital scale that would allow it to move from a single community model into something that could work in cities across the country. He said the right things. He asked the right questions, and I told him things I should not have told someone I hadn't yet learned to trust. Samuel paused. That was my mistake. I own it. He let the honesty of that admission sit for a moment before continuing. What happened after it was not a misunderstanding. It was not a difference of vision. It was systematic. My licensing filings began encountering complications they had never encountered before. Community partners who had been with the project for years suddenly became unavailable. Investors who had committed capital withdrew without explanation. A financial complaint appeared, an accusation of mismanagement that had no foundation but took years and money I didn't have to fight. He spoke without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. You can destroy a man without touching him if you have enough money and enough patience and enough access to the systems that gatekeep legitimacy. The room was completely silent. I fought it for a long time. Then I ran out of things to fight with. He touched the bracelet on his wrist. One brief, deliberate contact, the same gesture Lena had noticed twice before tonight. My wife died while I was still fighting. My daughter, his voice did not break, but it changed in texture, or the way a material changes when pressure is applied to it. My daughter had to be sent somewhere safer, while the people who had destroyed my career made clear they weren't finished. He looked up from the podium. I made a choice to become invisible. I thought invisible meant safe. I thought if I stopped being findable, the people I loved would stop being targets. He looked at Ethan. "Do you remember me?" he said. "Because I remember you. I remember the color of the chairs in the room where your father told me we were going to change something together. I remember the window facing the street. I remember the coffee that nobody drank getting cold on the corner table. I remember you sitting in the corner with a notepad on your knee, not speaking, watching everything." His voice remained entirely even. "You were learning." "I understand that now. You were learning from the most thorough teacher available, and that teacher was showing you that a man's life's work could be quietly taken from him while he was still shaking your father's hand." Ethan did not answer, but his face did. The color had drained from his expression in stages, the way light leaves a room when a storm covers the sun. What remained was not the face of a man caught in a misunderstanding. It was not the face of a man who had been presented with accusations he could credibly contest. It was the face of a man caught, plainly, completely, in a room full of witnesses, and the distinction between those two things was visible to everyone watching. Several people who had come to this evening as Ethan's allies found themselves suddenly uncertain what alignment now cost them. The board member at the third table stood up from his chair. He didn't leave, and he didn't speak. He simply stood, as if the seated position was no longer appropriate for whatever this was becoming, as if sitting while this unfolded made him complicit in a way he wasn't prepared to be. Another board member, 2 tables away, leaned across to the colleague beside him and said something in a voice too low to carry. The colleague's expression did not change, but his hand moved to his jacket pocket where his phone was. 2 journalists in the press section were typing without looking up. Renee Slade, still near the staff entrance, had her own phone out. She was not sending a message. She was looking at it the way people look at something they know will need to be dealt with but cannot yet deal with, a future problem arriving in real time. Victor Lang stood at the edge of the stage and looked at Samuel Reed with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to stop pretending he doesn't know what he knows. He was no longer still. His weight had shifted forward slightly, the posture of someone preparing to speak rather than simply observe. And Samuel stood at the podium with his worn document and his bracelet and his 20 years of silence finally broken, and waited with the particular unhurried patience of a man who has already done the hardest part and knows that the rest will follow for the next piece of truth to find its moment. The silence after Samuel's question was not the silence of a room waiting for an answer. It was the silence of a room that had already received one. Ethan's face had given him away before his mouth could form a single word of defense. The color had left him, and what remained was something that the people who had spent years reading him, board members, rivals, reporters who had covered him long enough to learn the difference between his performed emotions and the real ones, recognized as something they had never seen on him before. Not embarrassment, not indignation. Fear, moving underneath the skin of a man who had spent decades making sure that fear was always someone else's experience. He tried to recover. He pulled the smile back into position the way a man pulls a jacket closed against wind. The gesture technically worked, but the cold got through anyway. He looked at the room and opened his mouth. And what came out was a short laugh designed to signal that the situation was being misread, that whatever dramatic energy Samuel had generated in the last several minutes was the product of confusion and emotion rather than anything requiring serious attention. "I think we're all being a little swept up in the moment," Ethan said. His voice was careful and bright and approximately 3 notes above where it lived naturally. "Samuel clearly has strong feelings about some difficult history, and I respect that." "My name," Samuel said without raising his voice at all, "is Dr. Samuel Reed." The title fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward immediately. Several people reached for their phones. A woman near the center table said something to her companion that was too quiet to hear, but accompanied by an expression of sharp reassessment. The journalists in the press section, who had been typing steadily for several minutes, typed faster. Samuel waited for the room to absorb it. Then he continued. "Decades before the beard and the sidewalk and the invitation your assistant delivered to me outside a convenience store, I was a civil engineer and urban development strategist. I held licenses in 3 states. I had published work in 2 academic journals and presented before city councils in 4 cities. I ran a team of 11 people who believed, as I did, that the way communities developed didn't have to be a story of erasure." He paused. "I built things, real things, with things that were meant to last and meant to belong to the people living inside them." He looked out at the audience, not at Ethan, not at any single person, but at the collective weight of the room. The Crown Meridian project was not just architecture. It was not just finance. It was personal to me in the way that only a thing built for the people you come from can be personal. I grew up watching families like mine, hardworking, rooted, decent, get moved, get priced out, get told that the neighborhood they'd lived in for 2 generations was being improved, and that improvement somehow required their absence. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible concession to the weight of what he was saying. Crown Meridian was my answer to that. It was the proof I intended to give, that you could build something lasting without destroying the people already living where you wanted to build. He placed one hand on the folded document. Ethan Caldwell's empire was born by taking the skeleton of that model, stripping out every protection that made it ethical, and rebuilding it as a machine for the kind of profit that requires someone else's loss. The flashback that Samuel described was not abstract. He spoke about it the way someone speaks about a period of their life that was so vivid and specific that time has not softened its edges, the way people remember the years when the most important things in their lives were being decided. He described a younger version of himself in modest offices that smelled like old paper and strong coffee. Long evenings refining the legal language around community ownership protections, because the language had to be precise enough that no future development partner could quietly rewrite it without the change being visible. He described the people on his team, a young structural engineer named Marcus who argued with him about specifications until they both got it right, a community liaison named Diane who knew every block captain within 4 miles by first name and could tell you which city council member was reachable and which one had already been bought. He described the families who attended the early planning meetings, who brought their children and their skepticism and their guarded hope because they had been promised things before, and had learned to hold promises at a distance while still showing up to hear them. "I was not a perfect man," Samuel said, the same admission he'd made earlier, but weighted differently now that the room had more context. "I was stubborn, and I moved fast, and I sometimes didn't listen well enough to people who were slower than me and right. But I was a builder. That is the truest thing I know about myself. I built for people who were tired of watching the things built around them belong to someone else." He looked directly at Ethan. "Charles Caldwell came to us in the 3rd year of the project, when the model was complete enough to be desirable and early enough that we still needed capital to scale it. He was charming. He was knowledgeable. He used the right language, community partnership, shared equity, long-term investment. He praised the framework in specific terms that told me he had actually read it, rather than simply scanning its executive summary the way most people did." Samuel's voice carried something that was not quite bitterness, but was adjacent to it, the specific pain of a trust that was deliberately cultivated. I believed him because I wanted to, because we needed what he was offering, and because I made the mistake of assuming that a man who understood the work understood its purpose. Samuel waited a beat. And you, he said to Ethan, were in that room, sitting in the corner, not speaking, taking it all in. Ethan said, "You're rewriting. You wore a blue tie with a diagonal stripe. You kept a legal pad on your knee and filled 4 pages of it. When your father said something you agreed with, you nodded twice." He held Ethan's gaze. "I noticed you because you reminded me of the best students I had worked with, the ones who were learning something real." The room was absolutely silent. "I should have understood what kind of student you actually were." Victor Lang moved. He had been standing near the foot of the stage for the better part of 15 minutes, close enough to hear every word clearly and far enough to have maintained the technical position of an observer. That position ended now. He stepped forward into the open space between the nearest table and the edge of the stage, and when he spoke, his voice carried to the room without him having to raise it. "My name is Victor Lang," he said, addressing not Samuel, but the audience. "Several of you know me. I've done business in this city for over 20 years. He paused. "I was a junior acquisitions analyst in a firm that ran adjacent to Caldwell Capital during the period Samuel is describing. I was 26 years old, and I was learning the business, and I was very good at not seeing things that it was professionally inconvenient to see." The room was watching him with the complete attention of people who understand that something is happening that will matter later. "I saw enough," Victor said. "Not everything, but enough to understand that what was being done to Samuel Reed and his project was not a negotiation that went wrong. It was deliberate. The displacement of a man's professional standing, the contamination of his reputation through manufactured complaints, the systematic withdrawal of support from people who had been pressured. I saw the edges of all of it." His voice did not waver, but its quality changed slightly. "And I told myself I didn't know enough to say anything. I told myself it wasn't my business. I built a career on that decision." He looked at Samuel. "I'm sorry," he said. Simply and directly, without the embellishments that people add to apologies when they're more concerned with their own absolution than with the person they're apologizing to. Samuel looked back at him for a long moment. He did not perform forgiveness, and he did not perform rejection. He simply received it, the way you receive something whose value you'll assess later when the immediate pressure of the moment has passed. Then Samuel reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The recorder was small, a device converted from cassette-era technology into something with a digital output, the kind of preservation that required both intention and patience. He set it on the podium beside the folded document. Then he placed beside it a printed transcript, stapled at the corner, with handwritten margin notes in ink faded to a brownish color, suggesting significant age. He looked at Ethan. "I did not come here tonight to ask for dignity," Samuel said. "I came here with your father's voice." The room went so quiet that the ventilation system became briefly audible, a soft mechanical hum that underlined the weight of the silence in the way that background sounds do when everything else stops. Ethan stared at the recorder. Something moved across his face that had no performance in it. A raw, involuntary response that the cameras, still running, caught without commentary. He knew what was on it. That was the thing the room understood, watching him. A man who didn't recognize the recording would look confused. A man who recognized it and was innocent of its contents would look indignant. Ethan looked neither confused nor indignant. He looked like a man staring at something he had believed was gone. "We'll hear it together," Samuel said, and looked toward the AV station at the side of the room. Lena was already moving before Samuel finished the sentence. She had been at the coordination station for the past 20 minutes, and in that time she had found enough fragments to understand the rough shape of what had happened to Samuel Reed. The planning newsletter, a brief archived reference in a city legal database to licensing complaints filed against a development entity during the relevant period. A single scanned document she'd turned up through a municipal archive that showed original Crown Meridian planning language alongside a later Caldwell-adjacent filing in which that language had been reproduced almost word for word, with the community protections quietly excised. She understood enough now that what Samuel was asking the AV system to do felt not like a dramatic gesture, but like the most reasonable thing that had happened all evening. She walked past two members of Ethan's security staff, one of whom started toward her and then reconsidered when she looked at him directly and kept walking, and reached the AV board. She plugged in the recorder's output cable herself, adjusted the input level, and looked out at the room. Ethan's voice came from behind her. "Don't." She turned the volume up and pressed play. The recording crackled through the first 2 seconds the way old audio does, a texture of magnetic age, the sound of time preserved imperfectly. And then a voice filled the ballroom that several people recognized immediately because Charles Caldwell had been recorded and archived and eulogized enough times that his particular vocal register, measured, patrician, with a warmth that was always slightly more practiced than genuine, was familiar to anyone who had followed his career closely. He was heard discussing the Crown Meridian framework in specific terms. He called Samuel's approach idealistic in a way that limits its commercial application. He discussed, with the calm efficiency of someone talking about an accounting problem rather than a human being's life's work, the mechanics of repackaging the framework, removing the community protections, restructuring the ownership models, separating the intellectual property from the man it belonged to. He discussed, with the same casual efficiency, the steps needed to isolate the man from his institutional relationships before he finds legal standing to challenge the restructuring. Gasps moved through the room in a wave. Ethan lurched toward the AV station. He did not reach it. Victor, who had been anticipating exactly this moment, stepped into his path, not physically blocking him, but placing himself in the space with enough deliberate presence that Ethan's stopping was the only version of the next 3 seconds that didn't become something worse than what was already happening. Ethan's security moved and then hesitated, or because a room full of cameras and journalists and board members made the calculus of physical intervention extremely difficult to recommend. "That recording is fabricated," Ethan said to the room. Loudly, clearly, with the force of a man who has decided that certainty will do the work that truth cannot. "It has been manipulated. It was obtained illegally, and it doesn't represent—" But the room was not listening to him. The room was listening to Charles Caldwell's voice finish its sentence, and then listening to it again because Lena had not stopped the playback. While the recording played, Lena returned to the coordination station and opened her laptop again. The investigative reporter she'd been messaging, a woman named Dana Okafor who covered institutional finance and had the particular gift of following document trails that other people found too tedious to pursue, had responded to Lena's earlier message and attached several files. Lena opened them quickly and began reading. Archived nonprofit filings, permit records from municipal databases, city council transcripts from the period Samuel had described. Dana had pulled them within the last 40 minutes, working from the fragments Lena had sent her, and the picture they assembled was both larger and more specific than Lena had expected. The language protecting community ownership in Crown Meridian's original framework had been replaced in subsequent Caldwell-connected filings so gradually that no single change was dramatic enough to flag as a reversal. It had been done in increments, a clause softened here, a definition narrowed there, a residency requirement quietly removed from an equity provision. The kind of systematic erasure that required someone who understood the original document well enough to know exactly which protections were doing the most work. And underneath that trail, in the earliest acquisition records, a cluster of shell entities connected to Caldwell Capital had moved through neighborhoods that Samuel's original organizing work had mapped and prepared for community-led development. Those neighborhoods had been organized. Their residents had been consulted. The relationship infrastructure Samuel's team had built had made them, paradoxically, easier to acquire quickly, because someone with access to that infrastructure could move through it like a key through a lock that had been made for someone else. Lena sat back and looked at what she was reading. This was not a story about one man being wronged. This was a story about a method. At the podium, Samuel let the room absorb what it had heard. He gave it time. He had learned through a long life of watching powerful people in rooms like this one manage the space between exposure and accountability, that the most dangerous moment was the one immediately after the truth arrived, when people were still deciding whether to receive it or deflect it. "I did not disappear because I gave up," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have spent time on the street that I would not have wished on any person, but it was not the result of failure. It was the result of a campaign." He spoke the word plainly, without drama. When you run out of money to fight and your reputation has been carefully contaminated and the lawyers who might have helped you have been quietly redirected away from your case, you do not give up. You become invisible, because invisible is the only form of survival still available to you. He touched the bracelet again. "I had a wife named Gloria. She was a nurse. She had a particular way of being in a room that made the room feel more organized than it actually was. She brought that quality to everything around her, including me, which I needed more than I usually admitted." His voice was very quiet now, but the room's silence was complete enough that it carried. "She died of an illness that moved faster than our reduced circumstances could manage. I was not able to give her what she deserved at the end. That is a thing I live with." He paused. "I have a daughter. I sent her away when the threats around me became specific enough that her proximity to me was dangerous rather than protective. That was the hardest decision of my life. It was also, I believed, the right one." He looked out at the room. "I have not been without her in every sense, but I have been without her in the ways that matter most to a father." A woman at the front table had stopped attempting to maintain her composed expression. She was not alone. "Tonight," Samuel said, "I came for two things. I came for the truth to breathe in public, and I came for her." Margaret Caldwell had been seated at the front left table all evening, positioned by the event seating chart at the precise angle that made her visible as a dignified presence, without requiring her to participate in anything. She was 71 years old, and she wore that age with the particular composure of a woman who had learned very young that composure was the most reliable form of control available to her. He had been watching her son deteriorate in front of a room full of cameras for the past 40 minutes with the expression of a woman performing stillness while the interior of her life rearranged itself into something she was not going to be able to restore. When Charles's voice had filled the ballroom through the recording, something in her face had closed. Not broken, closed. The way a door closes quietly rather than slamming, which is in some ways a more final sound. She stood up. Ethan turned toward her with the instinct of a man looking for an ally. "Stop," she said to him. One word, quiet enough that the nearest tables heard it rather than the whole room. But those were exactly the tables that mattered. He stared at her. "I knew," she said, and the room went still in the way that rooms go still when something private becomes unavoidably public. Not all of it, not the extent, but I knew enough to understand that what Charles had done to that project was not what he told me it was. She did not look at Samuel. She looked at her own hands on the table. "I told myself it was business, that the world Charles operated in had rules I wasn't qualified to judge." She finally looked up, not at Ethan, not at Samuel, but at the middle distance of a woman reckoning with a choice made years ago. "I was qualified. I simply chose comfort over the alternative." Ethan said her name with a warning in it. "I am speaking," she said, and he went silent, because whatever authority he had held over this room for the past hour, he did not hold it over his mother in this moment, and everyone could see it. Samuel turned back to the room. "Ethan's philanthropy," he said, "the language of his foundation, the speeches about restoring dignity and stabilizing vulnerable communities, and creating ownership pathways for families who have been excluded from prosperity, that language did not originate with him, or with his speechwriters, or with the consultants his PR team hired." He let the pause do its work. It originated in the Crown Meridian planning documents, in the framework I wrote. The moral vision of the project he took was absorbed so completely into the brand of the empire that replaced it that the man who destroyed me ended up using my own words to make himself appear generous. Several donors who had contributed to Ethan's foundation over the past several years looked physically ill. One man at the second table placed his fork down with a finality that suggested he was done with the evening in a way that went beyond the food. Victor, who had positioned himself where he could see both Samuel and the board members simultaneously, spoke again. "I came across a set of internal documents last month during due diligence work related to a pending transaction," he said. "I didn't understand their significance until tonight. Those documents show irregular valuation adjustments in the earliest Caldwell acquisitions, adjustments that benefited the acquiring entity in neighborhoods that had been, according to the public record, community organized and mapped for resident-led development." He looked at the board members directly. "If those acquisition records connect to the Crown Meridian documentation and the recording we've just heard, the exposure is not merely reputational. It is regulatory. It is shareholder-facing, and depending on the jurisdiction and the statute of limitations analysis, it may be criminal." The board member who had stood up earlier sat back down. Then he picked up his phone. Samuel gripped the podium. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady. But something in his bearing had shifted. A small, internal thing that Lena, watching from across the room, recognized as the particular quality of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and is finally, cautiously, setting it down. "I spent years imagining this moment as something that would feel like victory," he said, "like the particular satisfaction of watching a man finally carry his own weight in front of people who had only ever seen him without it." He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't feel like that. It feels like the truth feels. Complicated and too late for some of the people it should have protected, and still necessary." He looked toward the back of the ballroom. Not at Ethan. Not at the cameras. At the rear left corner of the room, near the service entrance, where the light was thinner and the crowd had not filled in completely. "I spent years believing I had to choose between pursuing justice and keeping my daughter safe," he said. "Tonight, I came for both." The room turned. A woman stepped out from the shadow near the service entrance. She was in her early 30s, composed in the way that people are composed when composure has been deliberately cultivated through difficult years. Not cold, but controlled, the kind of control that has been built over something rather than in the absence of anything. She was dressed simply, and she moved with the directional certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has known it for some time. Samuel's voice, for the first time all evening, was not quite steady. "My daughter," he said. Ethan stared at her. And the room did not yet understand why the sight of her produced that particular expression on his face, the specific, draining recognition of someone encountering a problem they had believed was safely contained, now standing in the open, looking back. But they would. She walked the way people walk when they have spent years preparing for a single room and have finally arrived in it. Not fast, not slow. With the kind of directional calm that turns a walk across a ballroom floor into a statement, The way Samuel's walk to the podium had been a statement, except where his had carried the weight of something long endured, hers carried the specific quality of someone arriving exactly on schedule. Her name was Ava Reed. She was 32 years old, and in the professional circles that overlapped with real estate governance and corporate compliance, she was known under her mother's family name. A deliberate choice made years ago in the early days of a career she had understood would eventually bring her into proximity with the people responsible for her father's destruction. She had kept that distance between her legal name and her real one, the way you keep a hand close to a door handle in a room you're not sure you'll be able to leave. Several people in the ballroom recognized her immediately. Not from her connection to Samuel, that was not yet public knowledge, was not yet anything. They recognized her from boardrooms and compliance reviews and the particular professional network that connected corporate risk assessment to regulatory guidance. She had a reputation in those circles for being meticulous, unreadable, and impossible to redirect once she had identified a problem worth pursuing. Ethan recognized her most of all. He stood at the edge of the stage and watched her cross the room and understood, in the particular way that cornered men understand the full geometry of what has happened to them, that the woman he had hired indirectly through a risk review network to assess structural vulnerabilities in one of his pending acquisitions had been doing exactly that, and had found something much older and much more significant than the deal she had been asked to evaluate. He had never known her last name. She had been introduced through intermediaries, referred by a compliance firm that had no reason to flag her background, and she had appeared in his professional orbit as simply a sharp, thorough analyst with no obvious personal stake in the work. She had given him no reason to look more closely. She had been, in every professional interaction, exactly as neutral and precise as her reputation suggested. She had not been neutral. Ava reached the stage and stopped at the foot of it. She looked up at her father. There was a moment between them that the room watched without fully understanding. Years of distance and silence and grief compressed into something that expressed itself not in the dramatic gestures such reunions are supposed to produce, but in something much quieter. Samuel looked at his daughter and his composure, absolute all evening, shifted in a way that was barely visible and completely unmistakable, the way a man's face shifts when he has stopped bracing for something and finally allows himself to believe it is real. Ava looked at him the way someone looks at a person they have spent years being angry at for leaving, then understanding why they had to, then forgiving, then grieving what the leaving cost, then arriving at something that was neither forgiveness nor grievance, but simply love in the form that survives complicated things. "I've been looking at your work for 2 years, she said to him quietly, not knowing it was yours. Samuel nodded. Once. That was all. Then he straightened, and she straightened beside him, and together they turned to face the room. Lena had been watching from the coordination station when Ava walked in, and she had made a decision in the 3 seconds it took her to understand who Ava must be. She closed her laptop, stood up, and walked past Ethan's aide, who reached for her arm and was ignored so completely that he didn't attempt to follow, and came to stand near the front of the room where she could see both the stage and the board members clearly. She pulled out her phone and messaged Dana Okafor 2 words. "She's here." Dana's response came back in under a minute. "Publishing in 20. Lena put her phone away and looked at Ethan. He was watching Ava with the expression of a man running calculations that kept producing the same unacceptable result. Ava spoke to the room. 6 months ago, she said, her voice carrying the professional clarity of someone accustomed to presenting findings to people who would prefer not to hear them. "I was brought into a compliance review connected to an acquisition structure involving entities linked to Caldwell Capital. The brief was narrow, specific regulatory concerns about a pending transaction. I accepted the work because I am good at it and because it paid well, and because I had not yet understood what I was looking at. She paused. Within 3 weeks, I found irregularities in the historical acquisition records that predated the current deal by decades. The irregularities pointed to a pattern, not a single transaction anomaly, but a structural method used consistently across multiple deals in a specific geographic corridor. I began pulling older records. The further back I went, the more clearly a single originating event came into focus. She looked at Samuel. I did not know when I started following that trail, when that it would lead me to my father. I knew the name Crown Meridian from his papers, from things I had kept from his office when I was young and did not yet understand what they meant. When that name appeared in the acquisition records I was reviewing, I stopped sleeping. The room had the absolute quality of a space in which everyone has simultaneously stopped managing their own reaction and is simply receiving what is being said. I have spent the past 3 months building a documented evidence package with the assistance of 2 regulatory contacts, a forensic accountant, and an investigative journalist. She reached into her bag and placed a sealed envelope on the edge of the stage. That package was shared with the relevant parties before I entered this room tonight. It includes the original Crown Meridian documentation, cross-referenced with Caldwell acquisition filings, the recording we have just heard, Victor Lang's internal documents, and a timeline of the systematic professional destruction of Dr. Samuel Reed that I have reconstructed from public records, archived legal filings, and 3 direct witness interviews. She looked at Ethan. I wanted to tell you myself that the thing you could not find, the thing you believed had been made sufficiently invisible, it was being found, one document at a time, by the person you should have been most afraid of. Ethan had gone beyond the performance of composure. He was simply standing, not performing anything, not trying to manage the room, because the mechanisms he used to manage rooms had all encountered the same problem simultaneously. They required an audience willing to be managed. And that audience was gone. He looked at Ava. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the envelope on the stage. Then something colder moved into his expression, the thing underneath the charm, the thing that had always been there and that the people who had worked closely with him for long enough had learned to recognize as the real center of him. Not cruelty exactly, calculation without conscience. The default setting of a man who had learned from his father that problems responded to force, and that force took many forms. You orchestrated this, he said to Samuel. His voice was quiet now, not the performed quiet of a man in control, but the compressed quiet of a man deciding how much damage he is still willing to do. You and your daughter. You positioned her inside my operations. You collected information under false pretenses. You arranged this evening as a performance. We arranged the truth, Ava said flatly. You arranged this evening. You invited my father here as a joke. The room heard that land. People like you, Ethan said, and the contempt in his voice was naked now. All the charm burned off. Always need someone else to blame for where they end up. Your father had every opportunity to. Be careful, Victor said from across the room. His voice was quiet and precise. Every word you say in front of these cameras is a future exhibit. Ethan stopped. He looked at Victor with the expression of a man who has been betrayed, which was its own kind of information, because it confirmed that he had understood Victor's presence in his orbit as something that could be relied upon, and now understood that he had been wrong about that too. Margaret Caldwell rose from her table again. She crossed the room toward Ava with the slow, deliberate movement of a woman who has made a decision and is giving herself the walk to confirm it before she arrives. She stopped in front of Ava and looked at her for a long moment. Recognition and grief and something more honest than shame, which is shame that has stopped negotiating with itself. I have kept boxes, she said, Charles's papers, correspondence, legal documents he brought home, notes in his own hand about decisions never formally recorded. She paused. I kept them because I could not destroy them and could not look at them. I called that ambivalence for 20 years. Ava looked at her steadily. I will give you everything, Margaret said, not to be forgiven, because it belongs to the record, and the record belongs to the truth. Ava nodded. Once. Margaret returned to her table. She did not look at Ethan. Ethan made one final attempt. He crossed the floor toward Samuel, not toward the stage, but toward the man himself, as if by reducing the encounter to two people talking privately, he could somehow shrink what had become a public reckoning back into something containable. He stopped a few feet away. His voice was low and directed at Samuel alone, though the room's silence made it audible to everyone nearby. Name a number, he said. A settlement, handled quietly, structured properly. You get restoration. Your daughter keeps her career. Nobody has to go through years of litigation. Samuel looked at him. The look lasted long enough that Ethan's offer had time to fully reveal what it was. Not a gesture of accountability, not even a practical solution, but the same instinct that had driven everything else. The belief that money was a universal solvent, that every problem was ultimately a negotiation, that even this could be bought back into silence if the number was right. You still think, Samuel said quietly, that this is about what I lost. Ethan said nothing. It's about what you made normal. He turned away from Ethan and walked back to the stage. The Caldwell Grand did not empty all at once. It fractured. Donors moved away from tables in ones and twos, gathering coats and bags with the subdued efficiency of people who need to leave a place but don't want to appear to be fleeing it. Board members clustered in small groups near the exits, their conversations conducted in the low, a rapid register of people doing institutional damage assessment in real time. Two of the junior foundation staff were crying quietly near the service hallway, though it wasn't entirely clear whether from shock or from the more complicated emotion of working for years inside a machine and only now understanding what it had been producing. The press section had not moved. The journalists were still there, still typing, their cameras still running. Ethan stood in the center of the ballroom that bore his family's name. The guests who had arranged themselves around him all evening, who had laughed at his jokes and sought his attention and been grateful when he granted it, had rearranged themselves in relation to something new, and that rearrangement had left him at the center of an empty circle. So two senior board members approached him together. Their expressions were not unkind. They were simply the expressions of people who have a professional obligation to say a thing that cannot be avoided. We need to discuss an emergency review process, the first one said, before morning. You'll receive the formal notice tonight, the second added. An independent suspension pending full investigation. That's not a negotiation. It's a fiduciary requirement, given what's now on record publicly. Ethan looked at them. He opened his mouth. The response he found was not an argument and not a capitulation, but simply the exhausted remnant of a man who has been operating on one fuel source for his entire adult life and has just run out of it. He said nothing. The board members left, others followed, the cameras kept running. Dana Okafor's first alert published at 11:43, while the gala was still technically in session. The headline was careful and specific. It named allegations, named documents, named the recording, and identified Samuel Reed by his full title. Within 8 minutes, 2 other outlets had picked up the alert and were building their own pieces from the footage that had been streaming from the press pool cameras all evening. Guests who had already left were reading headlines in their cars. Guests who were still inside were reading the same headlines at the tables where they had eaten dinner an hour earlier. The story was moving faster than any PR team could position ahead of it, which was the only kind of speed that actually mattered in these situations. But Renee Slade had left the building 20 minutes before the first alert published. That, too, would be noted. Samuel took the microphone one final time. The room that had laughed at his arrival was now quiet in a completely different way. Not the quiet of discomfort or performative pity, but the quiet of people who have witnessed something and are still absorbing its full weight. "I want to say something about what tonight was," he said. "Not about what it exposed, about what it was." He looked out at the faces still in the room, board members, donors, journalists, staff, the caterers who had stopped pretending to work and were simply watching from the edges. "I am 68 years old. I have slept in doorways. I have eaten from places that the people in this room will never see from the inside. I have watched the seasons change from street level in ways that most of you will never be required to understand." He paused. "And for years, for a long time, the people who passed me on the street looked at me and saw the end of a story. A man who had failed at life, a cautionary thing. He held the room with no effort at all. Poverty is not the end of a story. Most of the time, it is the middle of one, the part where the damage done by other people has compounded long enough to become visible. The part where the systems that were supposed to catch someone have been quietly defunded or redirected or simply never built for people who look like me." His voice was level and certain. "I am standing here tonight not because I survived despite who I am. I am standing here because of who I am, and because the work I built was real enough. And the truth I carried was documented enough, and my daughter was determined enough to find her way back to both." He looked at Ava, standing now at the side of the stage. She looked back at him. "Revenge would have been easier," he said to the room. "I had that fantasy for years. But revenge would have left the wound in Ethan's hands, left him holding the definition of what this night meant. What I want instead is something harder and more lasting than revenge." He reached into his jacket pocket. The document he placed on the podium this time was not old. It was printed on clean paper, crisp at the edges, with a format that suggested professional legal drafting. "For the past 8 months, Samuel said, with my daughter and with a team of housing attorneys, community organizers, and financial compliance specialists who believed in the work before they knew whose work it was, I have been rebuilding the Crown Meridian framework, not as a memory, as a functioning initiative." He looked at the envelope Ava had placed on the stage earlier. "Any settlement recovered from Caldwell-connected entities, any asset recovery tied to the fraud, any damages the legal process produces, none of it will go into a fund with my name on it. None of it will become a platform for my restoration at the expense of the actual purpose." He set his hand flat on the document. "It will go into a community land and apprenticeship trust governed by residents of the neighborhoods that were mapped and organized and then preyed upon. Managed not by billionaires with charitable instincts, but by the people who have always understood those communities from the inside." The room was completely still. "The Crown Meridian Trust will protect housing, train local workers, and return to families in those neighborhoods the economic participation that was designed for them and stolen before it could arrive." He looked out at the donors still seated at their tables. "If there are people in this room who came tonight believing they were giving to something real, there is something real to give to now." Victor Lang began to applaud. He was the first, and he was alone for 2 full seconds, which in a room like this felt like a long time. Then Lena joined him. Then a woman from the foundation section. Then the applause moved through the room in the slow, uneven way that genuine applause moves, not the synchronized social reflex of a crowd performing appreciation, but the sound of people responding at different moments as the weight of the thing finally reached them. Ethan left through a side exit. There was no dramatic departure, no confrontation, no final exchange. He simply walked through a door that a staff member held open for him and was gone. The room barely registered it. The people who had spent the entire evening orienting themselves around his presence found that the room held its shape without him, which was its own kind of answer to the question of what he had actually been providing all along. Ava stepped beside her father as he came down from the stage. She offered him her arm. He took it. They walked together across the ballroom floor, not quickly, not with performance. Just walking the way two people walk when they have finally gotten back to each other after too long and don't yet need to say anything about it. Lena fell into step beside them. Victor followed a half-pace behind. The four of them moved toward the exit as the room around them continued its slow, irreversible transformation from Ethan Caldwell's charity gala into something that would be talked about, written about, and argued over for years to come. Margaret Caldwell remained at her table. She sat with her hands folded and looked at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who has done the necessary thing too late and is now in the long, quiet business of understanding what that costs. She would keep her word about the boxes. That would be her last act in relation to a legacy she had spent 40 years maintaining and could no longer justify. The time that followed was not quick or clean. Real reckonings never are. Ethan faced a board-ordered suspension within 48 hours. Regulatory inquiries opened on 3 fronts within 2 weeks, moving faster than such things usually move because the documentation was unusually complete and the public attention unusually sustained. Shareholder pressure built steadily. Within 4 months, he had been formally removed from operational control of Caldwell Capital, pending investigations that legal analysts described as likely to take years and unlikely to resolve in his favor. Samuel's name was reattached to his work. Interviews, published corrections, a formal acknowledgement from 2 city planning bodies that Crown Meridian had been original and its authorship misrepresented. An academic journal published a retrospective. A housing nonprofit that had been quietly referencing Crown Meridian principles for years without knowing their origin ran a full correction and invited Samuel to advise their board. He accepted. The Crown Meridian Trust broke ground on its first protected community project 14 months after the gala. It was a modest mixed-use development in one of the neighborhoods from Samuel's original organizing maps, a place that had been through 3 cycles of promised renewal without ever experiencing actual stability. The groundbreaking was attended by residents, local workers from the Trust's apprenticeship program, housing attorneys, and journalists who understood what they were watching well enough to write about it carefully. Lena was there, coordinating with the same precise, unobtrusive efficiency she brought to everything. She had left her event coordination firm 2 months after the gala and was now running community engagement for the Trust, work that used every skill she'd built in elite spaces and applied it to something she could respect without reservation. Victor was there too, near the back of the crowd. He had cooperated fully with the regulatory investigations and was navigating the professional consequences with the equanimity of a man who has decided that his reputation going forward matters more than his legacy from the previous chapter. Ava stood beside her father on the small outdoor platform. She had not left her professional practice. If anything, the Trust had given it new direction, and she was building a compliance framework for community development initiatives that she intended to make replicable in other cities. The bracelet was on Samuel's wrist. It had been there all night at the gala, and it was here now. Ava had asked him about it on the stage, in front of everyone, and he had told her what it was. A field marker from the first Crown Meridian development team, engraved with the coordinates of the neighborhood they had promised to protect. She had not said anything in response. She had simply looked at it for a long moment with an expression that Lena, standing nearby, recognized as the particular face of a person absorbing the full distance between what was and what should have been. Samuel stepped to the mic. Yet he looked out at the people gathered, residents, workers, families with children who had grown up in housing insecurity and were now watching the foundation of something different being laid in the ground in front of them. He thought about the ballroom. He thought about the laughter, He thought about the 40 feet of polished floor he had walked to a podium that was supposed to produce his humiliation and had instead become the place where everything he had spent 20 years keeping alive finally breathed in public. He thought about Gloria. He thought about the years. He thought about the doorways and the seasons and the long work of carrying something true through circumstances designed to make the carrying impossible. Then he leaned forward and said the words he had been finding his way back to for a very long time. "Oh, the night they laughed at me," he said, "was the last night they got to decide who I was." The families gathered in front of him began to applaud, and this time there was nothing performative about it at all. If everything you thought you knew about someone was built on a lie they never had to confess, would you have the courage to be the one who finally made them? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. There's more where this came from.